The morning the unmarked cars arrived in Elmsbrook, the wind was already rising. It came off the open fields in long cold ribbons, pushing dry leaves across the pavement and rattling the aluminum siding on the houses lined up along Alder Street. Most of the town was still waking, still pulling on coats, still waiting for the first hiss of coffee makers to break the quiet. No one expected the stillness to shatter the way it did. A small cluster of county vehicles rolled to a stop in front of a modest split level, home painted a fading shade of sage green. Frost still clung to the mailbox. The air smelled faintly of diesel from the grain trucks that had passed earlier, mixing with the earthy scent of corn stubble left in the fields after harvest. Curtains in nearby windows twitched as neighbors realized something unusual was unfolding. They recognized the sheriff's department trucks. They recognized the tension in the officers' shoulders as they stepped out, moving with a purpose that didn't belong to routine calls. A man emerged from the house, confused at first by the presence of uniforms walking up his path. He wore the same gray cardigan many in town had seen him wear to church potlucks and funerals. His expression shifted, slow and bewildered, as if the world had tilted without warning. He opened his mouth, perhaps to greet them by name. Then one of the deputies spoke quietly, and the man's knees seemed to lock in place. The chill in the wind deepened. Neighbors watched from behind glass, frozen between disbelief and a dawning dread. They had known him for decades. He had prayed beside them, updated their building permits, handed them church newsletters printed on the office's aging machines. They had seen him stand with bowed head during moments of silence for the very victims whose names now returned in whispers as the officers read him his rights. Inside the house, drawers were opened with careful hands. Boxes were carried out, each sealed in thick plastic bags. One of them was small, so small it could have been overlooked entirely and labeled only with 2 faded blue letters. The deputies held it with a precision that suggested they understood its significance long before they entered the house. From a distance, it looked like nothing. Just another outdated piece of office clutter from a past the town had tried to forget. A woman walking her dog paused at the corner, clutching the leash as she watched the scene unfold. She recognized the man being guided toward the vehicles, his eyes unfocused, his breath forming pale clouds in the cold. Her dog whined softly, unsettled by the shift in the air. She whispered something to herself, something like a prayer or a denial, as the realization began to settle into her bones. Across town, Sheriff Daniel Rowe stood at the edge of the courthouse parking lot, watching the sky pale toward mid-morning. He felt the wind seep through his coat, colder than he remembered from past winters. The radio on his belt crackled with confirmation that the warrant had been executed. After decades of silence, the words felt unreal. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of 46 years press through him, old cases resurfacing like long-buried stones rising after frost. He thought of the families. He thought of Mara Ellington and the picture he'd kept in his wallet through all these years. He thought of the long nights spent analyzing letters he could never quite decipher, feeling the pressure of a town that trusted him too much to accept the truth, that sometimes justice moves slower than grief. When the suspect was placed gently into the back of the waiting vehicle, a murmur rippled through the street. Not loud, just a subtle shift, like a collective exhale that didn't know whether to escape or remain trapped. People stepped back from their windows, unsure if seeing made them complicit in a wound reopening before their eyes. One neighbor, an elderly man in worn denim, approached the edge of his yard, gripping the fence post as though steadying himself. He watched the procession until the vehicles pulled away, tires crunching over grit and frost. His voice was barely audible when he spoke. "All this time," he whispered. All this time he was right here, on the passenger seat of the lead vehicle. A clear evidence bag held the pale, age-worn floppy disk. Light from the rising sun caught its surface, turning its plastic edge into a thin line of white. The object looked fragile, almost meaningless, but inside it lived the trail that led investigators to the man who had blended into there, lives so seamlessly that no one saw him for what he was. As the convoy drove toward the county facility, the town slowly came alive, porch lights switching off, children stepping onto school buses, the scent of breakfast drifting from kitchens. Normal life resumed, unaware that nothing was truly normal anymore. By noon, whispers would spread across Elmsbrook. By evening, disbelief would turn to shock, and shock to a betrayal so deep it reached the very rituals that had once held the town together. But on this cold morning, with the last of the frost melting into the dirt along Alder Street, the truth had finally taken shape. It existed not as rumor or instinct or whispered fear, but as evidence. Evidence strong enough to end a silence that had shadowed generations. To understand how this began, we go back to 1979. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. In the spring of 1979, when the air in Elmsbrook carried the smell of thawing soil and early lilac, Mara Ellington's days unfolded with a kind of gentle rhythm people remembered long after she was gone. She lived in a small blue house her parents had helped her rent, just 2 blocks from the elementary school where she taught music. The house was always tidy, curtains pulled back to let in the morning sun, sheet music scattered across the modest wooden table beneath the window. Every morning began with the soft scrape of a chair, the click of a kettle, and Mara humming whatever melody she planned to teach her students that day. Her neighbors often said she moved through the world as if she were carrying an invisible bowl of water, careful not to spill a drop. She walked with intention, spoke softly, and listened with a concentration that made the speaker feel steadier. Children adored her because she treated them as though each of them had a voice worth discovering. Adults admired her for the same reason. She was 27, with steady brown eyes and hands that always seemed to be in motion-tapping rhythms, adjusting sheet music, smoothing out the creases of her long skirts. Her mother liked to say she had a heart tuned to minor chords, meaning she felt the world deeply but carried her emotions quietly. Mara didn't disagree. Her classroom was her sanctuary. The walls held faded posters of orchestral instruments, and the old upright piano in the corner constantly fell out of tune, but she coaxed beauty from it anyway. Students would gather around her in loose semicircles as she taught them to count beats with their fingers, to hear harmonies hidden beneath simple melodies. When they struggled, she leaned close and whispered encouragements they remembered well into adulthood. One of her favorite rituals happened during lunch breaks. Instead of going to the teacher's lounge, she stayed in her classroom, windows cracked open to let in the scent of fresh-cut grass from the playground. She wrote notes to herself on small index cards, ideas for choir arrangements, birthday reminders for students, bits of lyrics she wanted to find again. Many of those cards she tucked into a folder inside her bag, carefully labeled "Someday," as if she knew her dreams needed a place to rest until life made room for them. Her connection to the church ran just as deep. Growing up in the choir had shaped her sense of belonging, and even after becoming a teacher, she never missed a Sunday service. After church, she often stayed behind to help organize hymnals or rehearse with the small volunteer choir. The church basement, its cement floor cool even in summer, was a familiar place filled with echoes of voices she had grown up beside. She kept copies of old newsletters in a box at home, dog-eared from being read and reread. They felt like pieces of community woven onto paper. Those newsletters would one day be examined by investigators, but in that moment, they were simply part of her world, innocent, mundane, comforting. Her closest friends described her laugh as the kind that surprised even her, bubbling up after moments of quiet. On warmer evenings, she liked to sit on her porch with her sketchpad, drawing rough shapes of the school garden or the silhouettes of passing birds. Music wasn't her only language. She loved capturing things she thought might disappear if someone didn't pay attention. The day before everything changed, she spent the afternoon rehearsing with her students for the spring recital. She wore a soft cream sweater, her hair pulled into the familiar loose braid. She moved between rows of chairs, gently adjusting posture, whispering reminders to breathe from the diaphragm, smiling each time a student gained confidence. At the end of the rehearsal, she handed out small slips of paper with encouraging notes, tiny sentences she wrote to every child individually. Her principal once told her it was unnecessary. She kept doing it anyway. When she walked home that afternoon, the sun sat low on the horizon, giving the fields a muted gold sheen. She stopped by the Ellingtons' house for dinner, as she did every Thursday. Her mother served a simple meal: chicken, green beans, bread warm from the oven. Her father asked about the recital, and Mara described each student with the affection of someone who viewed their successes as her own. They spoke about summer plans, about the possibility of Mara taking a weekend course in Omaha, about the school possibly replacing the old piano. At the end of the night, her parents walked her to the door, as they always did. Her mother hugged her tightly, reminding her to lock her windows during the early warm months when people tended to leave them cracked open. Mara laughed and promised she would. She stepped out into the cool air, carrying the faint scent of their house rosemary, old books, and something sweet like honey back to her own. Later, in her small home, she placed her bag near the table, sorted through papers for the next day, and tucked a fresh index card into the someday folder. She washed her hands, braided her hair for the night, and wrote a quick note to her mother on the kitchen notepad, planning to drop it in the mailbox in the morning before school. She ended the day the way she often did, sitting at her piano, touching a few tender chords until she found a melody that felt right. She left the piano lid open when she stood, a habit her father always teased her about. "It lets the music breathe," she used to say. When she turned off the lights, the house settled into its familiar quiet. Outside, the wind curled through the corn stubble and brushed against her windows. A neighbor across the street saw her silhouette for the last time, moving gracefully through her living room like a shadow in motion. Her final phone call happened just minutes later. She spoke with her friend Clara, who was helping organize the church fundraiser. Their conversation drifted from choir members to recipes to the weather. Mara laughed once softly, sleepily, before saying she was tired and needed to rest for the long day ahead. Nothing in her voice hinted at fear. Nothing suggested she sensed anything changing. She hung up the phone, placed it on the cradle, and walked down the hallway toward her bedroom. The wind picked up outside, brushing the windows again. The soft click of the lamp turning off was the last sound anyone heard from her house that night. By morning, the sun rose over Elmsbrook as usual, painting the fields in pale orange. Children biked to school, farmers checked their fields, and the church prepared for Sunday announcements. Everything looked the same, only one house stayed silent. And from that silence, a wound opened in the heart of a town that wouldn't heal for decades. The night Mara Ellington disappeared began like any other in Elmsbrook, with the quiet settling early across the houses and the wind drifting low over the fields. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset, leaving a thin crust of frost forming on the mailboxes and the tops of parked cars. By 10, most porch lights had blinked off, and only the faint hum of televisions and the occasional barking dog cut through the stillness. For a town accustomed to routine, the silence felt normal, almost comforting. But on one street, a rhythm shifted. At 10:42 p.m., a neighbor returning from a late shift saw Mara's living room lamp still glowing through the curtains. He didn't think much of it. She often stayed up late preparing music for her students. Another neighbor across the road saw the same light at 11:10 p.m. and again dismissed it. Elmsbrook was the sort of place where people trusted that nothing out of the ordinary would happen unless nature decided otherwise. At 11:37 p.m., the wind picked up, pushing dry leaves against the siding of Mara's house. A loose gutter tapped a steady pattern. If there was another sound, something softer, more deliberate, it was swallowed by the wind. The timeline that night would later be reconstructed from fragments: phone records, a wind meter, a neighbor's half-forgotten recollection, and the unusual pattern of objects discovered the next morning. But in that moment, Everything slipped beneath a layer of darkness no one recognized until it was too late. Around midnight, a passing patrol car glanced down Birchwood Lane. The officer noted nothing unusual. The curtains in Mara's home remained drawn, the lights still on. There was no movement. No shadow passing by the window. Just a quiet, ordinary house on a quiet, ordinary night. The actual crime unfolded in a silence so complete that no one in the surrounding homes sensed anything was wrong. The morning revealed everything. The discovery began with a single missed routine. Mara never arrived for her 7:45 a.m. choir warm-up with the older students. By 8:10 a.m., the school secretary attempted to call her, but the phone rang without answer. At 8:26, the principal drove past Mara's house on the way to the post office. The living room lamp was still on. That was the first crack in the routine. At 8:41 a.m., a neighbor named Louise Turner noticed Mara's mailbox flag was still down despite knowing she usually sent letters early in the morning. Louise crossed the street, intending only to leave a batch of cookies at the door. When she reached the porch, she felt a subtle wrongness before she even knocked. The doormat was crooked. A dried leaf clung to the doorframe despite Mara's habit of sweeping the porch each evening. The air felt strangely cold near the door, as if heat was leaking from inside. Louise knocked 3 times, no answer. She called Mara's name softly, still nothing. A moment later, she tried the doorknob. It turned without resistance. The door drifted open an inch, her breath hitched. She pushed it wider, only enough to call inside. The sound of her voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the quiet interior. She stepped back, heart pounding, and hurried home to call the sheriff. The first responding officer, Deputy Arnold Keller, arrived at 9:13 a.m. He approached the door carefully, noting the unlocked knob and the way the welcome mat was slightly folded at the edge. Inside, the air held a faint trace of perfume mixed with something else, an unsettled stillness, the kind that stops conversations before they begin. He called out Mara's name, waited, then stepped into the entryway. The house looked undisturbed at first glance. The living room lamp still glowed, casting a warm pale halo over the furniture. Sheet music lay on the table, exactly where Mara had placed it the night before. A mug sat on the counter in the kitchen, with a thin ring of tea dried at the top. Her keys still hung on the hook near the door. The absence of movement felt louder than anything else. Keller walked slowly around the living room, noticing a faint indent in the carpet near the couch, as if something had pressed down there recently. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no scattered belongings. The window latch on the far side of the room caught his attention. It was fully locked, but the edge of the frame had a faint smear of something pale, almost like dust or chalk. He noted it, but didn't touch it. Moving down the hallway toward the bedrooms, he noticed a faint scent, something metallic or sharp lingering in the air. The first bedroom was untouched, the bed neatly made. The second room, which doubled as Mara's study, contained her sketchpad open to a half-finished drawing. A single pencil lay diagonally across the page, pointing toward the doorway as though dropped quickly. When Keller reached the master bedroom, the air felt different. The bedspread was slightly rumpled, but not in a chaotic way, more like someone had sat on the edge of the bed briefly. On the knitstand, a lamp was switched off. Next to it lay a folded sweater and the small index card box labeled Someday. The lid was ajar, one card sticking out farther than the rest. A single sentence was written on it in Mara's careful handwriting. Remember the children's harmony exercise. The discovery that made Keller stop cold was the window. It was closed, but the lock was unfastened. The faint line of frost around the frame had melted irregularly, leaving streaks that suggested pressure from the outside. Along the bottom edge of the frame, a small fragment of frayed nylon thread clung to the wood. Pale, thin, almost invisible unless the light struck it at the right angle. He paced backwards slowly, heart rate rising. He stepped into the living room and radioed for backup. Within half an hour, the house filled with the quiet hum of investigators. Sheriff Daniel Rowe arrived at 10:02 a.m., slipping through the doorway like someone entering a church after hours. He looked around the room, noting the stillness, the soft lamplight, the mug on the counter. He had been in many homes like this during his young career, but something about Mara's house felt different, as though the warmth was still there, trying to cling to the air despite what had happened. Investigators moved carefully, weaving through the rooms. In the hallway, they found a faint drag mark crossing the rug, just one, narrow and straight, running parallel to the wall. It ended abruptly near the linen closet, which was closed. When they opened it, the towels were neatly stacked, untouched. The drag mark remained an unanswered question. The kitchen revealed another detail, a smudge near the back door, almost invisible. It looked like the brush of a sleeve or gloved hand. The lock on that door was still engaged from the inside. In the study, they found the timestamp on the sketchpad, a small note Mara had written in the corner dated the previous evening. It matched the time of her last phone call. The most unusual detail lay on the floor near the piano. One of the sheet music pages, normally arranged neatly, was turned upside down, the corner slightly torn. On the underside, a faint indentation revealed the pressure of something that had been laid on top of it. Not boots, not furniture. Something lighter, narrow, and rectangular. Later, forensic teams determined the indentations matched the size of an early model portable word processor, the kind used for small drafting tasks. It wasn't conclusive, but it raised questions that would echo for decades. By late morning, the search expanded into the yard. The grass near the back window showed subtle compression, difficult to distinguish from natural disturbance caused by wind. The soil beneath was dry and firm, offering no clear footprints. But beneath the window, on the siding, investigators found the faint trace of a fingerprint, too smudged to identify but undeniably present. A touch, a moment of contact. Something that shouldn't have been there. Inside the house, investigators cataloged every item: sheet music, pencils, the half-finished sketch, the sweater on the nightstand. But nothing explained the absence of Mara herself. No sign of transportation. No personal belongings missing. Her purse still hung on the hook in the kitchen. Her watch lay on the dresser. Her shoes remained lined neatly by the door. The sense of intrusion was subtle but absolute. By afternoon, news had spread quietly but swiftly through Elmsbrook. People paused mid-conversation, glancing toward Birchwood Lane, wondering what could have happened. No one suspected the truth yet. No one understood the shape of the storm that had entered their lives. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the grain silos, Sheriff Rowe sat in the living room one final time, looking at the lamp that had guided the neighbor's eyes earlier. He studied the arrangement of objects in the room, trying to sense what had broken the rhythm of Mara's quiet life. The nylon thread from the window frame rested in an evidence bag nearby, suspended like a single frozen breath. It was thin, almost weightless, but it carried the first true hint that this was more than a disappearance. Someone had planned something here. Someone had watched her long enough to know when she would be alone. When Rowe rose from the couch, he noticed one last detail. On the floor beneath the table where the sheet music sat, a church newsletter lay partially visible. The top corner bore the date, folded neatly as though held by careful hands. But the back side, faintly dusted in a pale residue, suggested it had recently been moved. Not by Mara, by someone else. It became the quietest clue of all, a piece of ordinary life disturbed by an extraordinary wrong. And for years to come, investigators would trace their fingers over that newsletter, trying to understand what it meant and why it was left behind when everything else had been taken. In the first weeks after Mara's disappearance, the investigation moved with an urgency that seemed unstoppable. Deputies interviewed neighbors, cataloged evidence, and walked the surrounding fields in long, tense lines. Sheriff Daniel Rowe kept a notebook full of theories and observations he revisited each night, convinced he was one careful step away from uncovering the truth. The house, the window frame, the nylon thread, the faint drag mark, each detail promised a hidden meaning. But the case resisted him from the beginning, as if the answers had been buried just slightly out of reach. The first suspect emerged within days. A farmhand named Joel Cray, who lived 2 streets over, had been seen walking late the night Mara vanished. His reputation for unpredictable behavior made him an easy target for local whispers. Deputies brought him in for questioning. They recorded his uneven statements and noted the bruises on his arms, remnants of a bar fight the week prior. But after hours of interrogation, Joel broke into frustrated tears, swearing he had been walking home after an argument with his brother. His alibi held up. A neighbor confirmed seeing him return home after midnight. By the end of the day, Joel was released, trembling with relief and anger. His mother confronted Sheriff Rowe in the parking lot, asking why her son had been treated like a criminal. Rowe could only apologize and promise they were chasing every possibility. The community wanted answers quickly. They wanted reassurance. But each week that passed without progress chipped away at their patience. Churchgoers whispered in small circles, parents held their children a little tighter, and teachers kept a closer watch on their students. The quiet streets of Elmsbrook felt slightly less safe, the wind more intrusive, every unexpected sound worth noticing. During the second month, investigators focused on a traveling salesman who had been in town the week Mara vanished. His route zigzagged through rural Nebraska, and his motel records placed him less than a mile from her house. When deputies questioned him, he answered politely, though his face tightened when they mentioned Mara by name. They searched his car, finding nothing but catalogs, loose papers, and a few scattered receipts. After a week of background checks, polygraph tests, and interviews with his employer, he was cleared. Still, the suspicion lingered around him for years, staining a life that had only crossed paths with Elmsbrook by accident. By summer, the case drew a steady stream of letters from amateur psychics, self-proclaimed experts, and people who believed they had seen something on the night of the crime, but couldn't quite place the memory. Some letters offered comfort. Others made promises. A few accused the investigators of incompetence. Rowe sat at his desk late into the evenings, sorting the mail into 3 piles: helpful, irrelevant, and cruel. The helpful pile was always the smallest. One call came from a woman in a nearby county who insisted she saw a dark-colored truck idling outside the school days before Mara disappeared. Deputies followed the lead relentlessly. They located the truck, its owner a quiet mechanic who had no connection to Mara. They searched his garage and his property, finding nothing unusual. When asked about the truck being near the school, he mentioned picking up his niece after a school event. His timeline matched perfectly. The file on him was closed quietly, though some residents were slower to let go of their suspicions. The first major dead end came that autumn. A smudge of a fingerprint on the siding near Mara's window had promised clarity, a direct link to whoever had entered the house. But when the lab results came back, the print was too partial, too distorted to match anyone in the system. It became another clue suspended in uncertainty, taunting investigators each time they reviewed the evidence list. During this time, rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed a stranger had stalked Mara. Others insisted someone local was responsible. Theories sprouted in church basements and grocery store aisles. People speculated about motives that made little logical sense, driven more by fear than reason. A few even whispered about the possibility of someone within the school being involved. The weight of those suspicions settled heavily on Mara's colleagues, especially her closest friends. Clara Evans, the woman who had spoken to Mara in her final phone call, came in for questioning multiple times. Each time, she brought a notebook of memories she had written down, hoping something small might help. She described her last conversation with Mara, repeating every detail as if reciting a confession. The fundraiser, the recipes, the weather, Mara's soft laugh. Deputies noted her trembling hands. The guilt she carried, though misplaced, stayed with her for years, Roe began to feel the strain most of all. His nights were consumed with reviewing the files, flipping through photographs, and pacing the length of his living room until dawn. His wife would find him standing by the kitchen window, staring out into the dark as if expecting answers to appear in the yard. He rarely spoke about the case at home, but the tension settled around him like a second skin. In the second year, an unexpected lead emerged from a hunter who had found a piece of torn fabric caught on a fence post near the wooded edge of town. It matched the color of one of Mara's sweaters. For a moment, the investigative team felt a resurgence of hope. They combed the area, searching through underbrush, along narrow trails, and near the creek bed. They found nothing. The fabric turned out to be from an old, discarded blanket likely carried by the wind during a storm months earlier. The hopeful spark faded quickly, leaving the investigators feeling foolish for believing they had been close. The third year brought the first anonymous letter. It arrived at the sheriff's office in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a page of typed text that mimicked the tone of local gossip, vague accusations, suggestions that someone within the community knew more than they admitted. The style was odd, filled with clipped phrases and overly formal language. Roe read it 3 times. He didn't believe it was written by anyone involved. It felt more like the work of someone wanting attention. Still, he filed it as evidence. A year later, another letter arrived, similar in tone, similar in phrasing. The origin remained unknown. By the 5th year, the investigation began to dissolve under its own weight. Deputies had transferred, retired, or moved on to other cases. Roe kept the files close, refusing to let them fade into storage. He created binders of patterns, compiling timelines, comparing statements, marking locations on maps with colored pins. Each attempt brought him back to the same starting point: a house that looked untouched, a window that suggested intrusion, a nylon thread no one claimed, and a life erased without explanation. The toll on the Ellington family deepened. Mara's mother, Eleanor, stopped singing in the church choir. Her father, Thomas, aged visibly within months. He visited the sheriff's office weekly, asking for updates, always polite, always composed. His voice carried the same steady concern each time. "Is there anything new, Sheriff?" Roe's replies grew shorter as the years dragged on. "Not yet. We're trying. We're not giving up." But the strain showed. At community meetings, Roe stood at the podium with dark circles beneath his eyes, facing townspeople who needed hope he couldn't provide. He delivered measured statements about ongoing efforts, reminding them they were still investigating. The murmurs afterward grew more skeptical with each passing year. In year 7, a new piece of forensic equipment gave investigators a chance to re-examine the faint drag mark in Mara's hallway. They hoped to trace fibers or residue. But the test came back empty. The mark was too old, too contaminated by years of environmental exposure. The result dissolved another fragile thread of hope. By the 10th anniversary, the case had become a quiet ache. The investigation existed more in memory than motion. Deputies who hadn't been on the force in 1979 learned about it through stories, not files. When people mentioned Mara's name, they did so softly, as though speaking about someone who had belonged to another lifetime. The moment of near collapse came 12 years after the crime. During an office reorganization, a box containing part of Mara's evidence nearly ended up in the discard pile. A clerk had mistaken it for old tax records. Roe intervened just as it reached the brink. He carried the box back to his office with shaking hands, realizing how close the case had come to an unintentional burial. That night, he sat alone in the dim office, staring at the evidence bags laid out in front of him. Nylon thread, a smudged print, the church newsletter with the pale residue. Objects that once held the promise of direction now felt like stones, heavy and immovable. He rubbed his forehead and whispered to himself, "There has to be a way back in." But no path appeared. Leads dwindled, interest faded. The town shifted its attention to newer concerns, economic issues, school renovations, weather cycles. The shadow of Mara's disappearance became something people carried privately rather than publicly. Even the rumor mill, once vibrant with theories, fell quiet. In the 10th year, Rowe made a final attempt to breathe life into the case. He requested additional lab work on the nylon thread, hoping advances in materials analysis would reveal something new. But the report came back unchanged, inconclusive, untraceable, unhelpful. When he held the report in his hands, a weariness washed over him, deeper than exhaustion, heavier than grief. He placed the report on top of the case file with a gentle finality. For the first time since the investigation began, he felt himself losing the thread. He walked to the window and looked out at the street, the same quiet road he'd seen for decades, unchanged except for the weight it carried. The official decision came quietly. The file was moved to the basement archive, not as a surrender, but as an acknowledgement of the limits of their reach. Rowe watched as it was placed on a shelf among dozens of other unresolved cases, the cardboard edges worn from years of handling. A deep silence settled in him. Something closed, even though he had never intended it to. He stood there for several moments, absorbing the stillness. Then he turned off the light and whispered a single line that lingered heavy in the air. Maybe some answers weren't meant for us. The years after Mara's disappearance settled over Elmsbrook like a long, slow winter cold in places no one could name, silent in corners that once carried music. Her absence threaded itself into the routines of those who loved her, shaping their lives in ways they never quite admitted aloud. Time moved forward, but the weight of her loss lingered, suspended like dust in sunlight. In the Ellington household, the piano became the quiet center of the home. On some evenings, Eleanor would sit beside it, fingers hovering above the keys without pressing a single one. She kept the lid open, just as Mara had left it. She dusted it weekly, smoothing the surface with careful strokes, as though wiping it might keep the last remnants of her daughter's presence from fading. Over time, she stopped moving the sheet music on the stand, allowing it to gather the soft yellowing edges that come from years of sunlight and air. Thomas aged in a different way. He became the sort of man who checked the mailbox every afternoon, even when no one expected a letter. After the first year, he stopped believing in miracles, but he kept believing in diligence. He carried a notebook of his own, filled with dates, news clippings, brief descriptions of people he thought the sheriff should speak with. Most of it led nowhere, but he persisted, driven by a steady, quiet devotion to the daughter whose absence had left a hollow in every room of their home. Friends drifted in and out over the years, each carrying their own version of grief. Clara Evans visited frequently at first, always bringing food or flowers or updates from the church. She spoke of the children in choir who still asked when Miss Ellington would return. Eventually, the visits grew less frequent, not from lack of care but from the ache of walking past the chair where she used to sit and laugh about the long days. Clara saved the last note Mara had written for her, a quick reminder about a fundraiser recipe, and tucked it into her own journal. It remained there for decades, pressed flat like a fragile leaf. As the years layered themselves over the town, memories of Mara shifted from fresh heartbreak to a softer, quieter presence. Some people remembered her voice. Others recalled her habit of leaning forward when listening, as if absorbing every word. Children who had once sat in her classroom grew up, left town, started families of their own. When they returned for holidays, they sometimes paused outside the old blue house, breathing nostalgia like a scent they hadn't known they missed. In time, the house changed owners. The new family repainted the walls, replaced the kitchen curtains, and planted rosebush beside the porch. But they kept the small indentation in the carpet by the living room window, saying it was part of the home's story, even if they didn't understand its origin. They knew only that something had happened in that space, something that shaped the town more deeply than most events ever could. Years turned into decades, and the investigation grew colder with each passing season. Cases, like people, faded. They sank into the background of office walls, eclipsed by newer tragedies. But every now and then, a flicker of possibility appeared. A traveler passing through Elmsbrook would mention seeing someone who matched a description no one had provided for years. A box of old police logs from a neighboring county revealed a possible connection. A stranger wrote to the sheriff, insisting they felt a strange pull toward the case, offering thoughts that hovered between obsession and hope. None of it held. Even so, the case never disappeared entirely. It lingered in quiet moments when Eleanor passed by the small box of newsletters Mara kept, when Thomas opened his notebook to add a speculative date, when former students returned to town and asked softly, "Did they ever find out what happened to her?" The answer was always the same. No, not yet. Time pushed forward relentlessly. The Ellingtons stopped attending community events. Friends invited them less often, unsure of how to bridge the chasm of grief that time had not managed to soften. The choir sounded different without Mara's voice weaving through it. Even the church basement felt altered, colder somehow, as if the unfinished hymn she once carried in her heart lingered between the concrete walls. Clara moved to Omaha in the late 80s, but returned twice a year to visit the Ellingtons. She brought photos of her children, updates about life, and a promise she continued to repeat each visit. "I haven't forgotten." She meant it. But distance has its own way of reshaping memory, smoothing the sharp edges and leaving softer, more abstract outlines. By the 90s, technology had crept into law enforcement in ways the town had never seen. New computers arrived at the sheriff's office, humming quietly on desks that once held manual typewriters. Deputies scanned old files, entering names into databases that promised faster connections. For a brief moment, the Ellington case flickered with possibility again. But the evidence, aged nylon thread, smudged fingerprints, faint indentations, offered little to these new systems. They matched nothing. They revealed nothing. Hope dimmed again. Sheriff Daniel Rowe remained the constant. He stayed in Elmsbrook long after most of his peers retired, carrying the weight of unsolved cases through every shift. Time etched lines into his face and thinned his hair, but his eyes retained the same steady clarity. He visited the Ellingtons each Christmas, standing quietly on their porch with a fruit basket or a bundle of evergreen sprigs. They rarely spoke about the case anymore, but the silence between them held an understanding deeper than any conversation could reach. Around the 20th year, Eleanor placed new photographs beside the old ones in their living room, images of nieces, nephews, and family gatherings. Yet Mara's picture remained at the center, unaltered, unfaded thanks to the care she took to keep it from the sunlight. Sometimes she sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the photo as if considering what her daughter's life might have become. She never voiced these thoughts. She didn't need to. Thomas aged into a man who moved slowly but spoke with precision. When he turned 70, he asked Rowe for the complete case file, not to challenge the investigation, but to understand. Rowe hesitated, then allowed him supervised access. Thomas sat quietly in the sheriff's office for hours, reading every report, every interview, every note. He said nothing as he closed the final folder. He only whispered, "Thank you for trying," before walking back to his car with a heaviness that settled into his shoulders. By the early 2000s, the town had changed. New families arrived. Old businesses closed. The school replaced the piano in the music room, retiring the instrument that had once carried Mara's hands. Students learned her name through a small memorial plaque near the auditorium, reading her story without fully understanding the depth of the loss behind it. Still, hope had a way of resurfacing in unexpected ways. It surfaced when the state introduced new digital archiving procedures, requiring counties to convert old records into electronic formats. Younger deputies, unfamiliar with the case but aware of its local legend, approached the project with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. They scanned documents, reviewed taped interviews, and converted evidence logs. Most of it felt routine, but every once in a while, A deputy paused over a detail, a date, a letter, a photograph, and wondered if the case might look different through modern eyes. It resurfaced when Thomas Ellington, now elderly but still clear-minded, visited the sheriff's office with a suggestion. Maybe it's time the state helps review these old files. They have tools we never had. His voice trembled not from weakness, but from the fragile desire to believe the future could rewrite what the past had locked away. It resurfaced in the brief moments when Rowe, alone in his office late at night, reviewed the case file out of habit more than strategy. He would look at the evidence photographs, the nylon thread, the newsletter with the pale residue, and wonder not with hope, but with a quiet curiosity if something had been overlooked. And sometimes, just sometimes, the possibility that the case might awaken flickered softly enough to keep him searching. The small hope grew, almost imperceptibly, when the county announced a full digitization of archived evidence, including materials stored for decades without review. The news reached the Ellingtons through a brief letter from the sheriff's office. Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest. Thomas stood still for a long moment, letting the significance settle. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a likelihood. But it was movement. And after 24 years of silence, movement, any movement, felt like a thin, precious flame against the long cold. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. By the time the evidence room in Prairie Cross County was ordered to undergo digitization, nearly 4.5 decades had passed since Mara Ellington vanished. Boxes sat in metal shelving units lined up like quiet sentinels, each holding pieces of stories that time had nearly erased. The process began as routine, contractors hired to scan old files, young analysts walking up and down the aisles with tablets, barcodes, and gloves that smelled faintly of vinyl. No one expected anything more than the resurrection of paperwork. Grace Mallory, a junior analyst assigned from the state, worked with a thoroughness that impressed even the older deputies. She was the kind of person who believed that forgotten things mattered, that memory hid in dust and cardboard the same way truth hid in people. On her second week in the basement, she reached for a drawer labeled Unsolved Homicide, 1970s-1990s, its metal edge biting into her palm as she tugged it open. Inside sat a row of manila folders, crisp at the edges from years of being shuffled, and behind them, pushed into the back as if someone had run out of space, was a small white box. The label on it was handwritten in blue ink, slightly smudged but still legible. Church, community material, do not discard. It caught her attention not because it was unusual, but because it had no business being in the homicide section. She carried it to a steel table and lifted the lid. Inside lay a disorganized collection of outdated media, CDs with faded stickers, zip disks, and at the bottom, 4 beige 3.5-inch floppy disks. Most had predictable labels: choir schedules, newsletter drafts, church directory backups. One disk, however, bore only 2 letters written neatly in ballpoint pen: PC. Grace stared at it for a moment, a faint unease settling in her chest. Decades-old instincts from past investigators seemed to hum beneath the surface of the plastic. She slipped it into an evidence pouch, logged it, and brought it upstairs for review. It reached the State Digital Forensics Lab in Lincoln 2 days later. The lab hummed with a cold precision. Machines lined the counters, their lights blinking in patient intervals. Lead examiner Dr. Leland Hart, a man with silver hair and the calm of someone who had spent a lifetime coaxing information out of obsolete technology, placed the disk gently onto an anti-static pad. He examined it with quiet care before inserting it into a USB-adapted drive, the device clicking softly as it gripped the floppy. As the machine began imaging the disk, the progress bar crept slowly across the screen. Grace watched beside him, absorbing the steady rhythm of fans and processors. When the directory finally appeared, 3 files surfaced: news LTR _04.doc.pb _draft1.doc sermon _notes.doc. Grace's breath caught quietly. Dr. Hart opened the second file. Lines of text filled the screen, short, clipped, deliberate phrases arranged with the same strange cadence found in the anonymous letters sent during the early years of the Plains binder case. The tone was unmistakable. But this document was rougher, filled with crossed-out phrases and overwritten sentences. A draft. Dr. Hart clicked into the metadata tools. Layer by layer, the hidden information appeared. Author, Ray H. Registered software owner, Halpern Municipal Services device name, CHRCHWS2. Last modified, April 12, 1994. 11:23 p.m. Grace felt her pulse tighten. She had grown up hearing whispered versions of the Plains binder story, never imagining she would see its digital footprint appear on a monitor in a brightly lit room. The next discovery was even more revealing. Embedded in the file was a printer signature tag, printed on CHR-CHPTR, the same model investigators had long theorized about, but never confirmed. A comment buried deep in the document code read, "Rewrite line 4, too specific? The invisible breath of a man editing his own cruelty." More analysis revealed a hidden draft of a second letter 1, mimicking the speech patterns of a truck driver who had been a suspect in 1986. The implication was chilling. The real killer had been prepared to frame an innocent man, someone who had lived under decades of unspoken suspicion. Grace stood still, absorbing the enormity of the revelation. The truth had not been uncovered by a witness, a confession, or a hidden diary. It emerged from a piece of obsolete technology no one had looked at since the early 90s. A disk that had sat in a box, mislabeled, misplaced, nearly thrown away. A disk handled by the same man who had spent years positioned at the heart of the community, leading prayers, organizing charity, events, and printing newsletters that families read with comfort, never knowing that his hands had also bound the nylon cord left near Mara's window. When Grace called Sheriff Rowe to report the findings, he said nothing for several seconds. His breath crackled faintly over the line. "Are you certain?" he asked. "The metadata is exact," she replied. "There's no ambiguity." Rowe closed his eyes, standing alone in the corridor of the sheriff's office. The images of Mara's house, the faint drag mark on the carpet, the nylon thread pressed against the window frame, all of it resurfaced, sharp and clear. For 46 years, he had carried the weight of the unanswered questions. Now, in a plain sentence delivered by a young analyst, the silence broke. He drove to Lincoln that afternoon, arriving as the sun dipped behind the complex. Dr. Hart walked him through the analysis, showing him the metadata, the printer signature, the timestamps, and the early drafts of letters preserved in the disk's memory. Rowe studied the evidence with slow, reverent movements, as though touching something sacred. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "We always thought he was someone close, someone who knew her routines." "Someone inside," Dr. Hart nodded. "He didn't hide in shadows. He hid in familiarity." The next steps unfolded with a gravity that pulled the past into the present. Deputies pulled older church rosters. They cross-referenced records from building inspections. They followed the trail left by the software registration. Each path converged on one name, Raymond Halpern. He had aged well, still attending church, still living in the same split-level house, still greeting neighbors with a quiet nod. The confrontation was inevitable. Before the warrant was executed, Rowe stopped by the Ellington home. Eleanor opened the door slowly, her posture fragile but steady. Thomas stood behind her, gripping the frame as though bracing for another disappointment. Rowe held his hat in both hands. He spoke with deliberate care. "We found something. Something real. Something that changes everything." Eleanor's eyes softened with a hope she had not dared feel in decades. "What did you find?" she whispered. "A disk," Rowe answered. "An old one. It has drafts of the letters. It has metadata. It has a name." Thomas's voice wavered. "Whose name?" Rowe hesitated only a moment. "Ray Halpern." Silence filled the room, heavy and transforming. Eleanor pressed her hand against her chest. Thomas closed his eyes, the years of strain folding into the curve of his back. For the first time in decades, the Ellingtons felt the painful brightness of truth breaking through. 2 days later, unmarked vehicles lined Alder Street. Officers stepped out quietly, moving with the solemnity of people who understood the significance of what they were about to do. When the door opened, Halpern looked confused, then fearful, then resigned. He asked a single question: "How did you find me?" Rowe held up the evidence pouch. "A disc," he said. "You left it behind." As Halpern was led away, neighbors stared from their windows, their disbelief etched in the cold morning light. Mothers who had accepted newsletters from his hands, men who had spoken to him after Sunday service, children who had waved to him on their bikes. In that moment, the community fractured not with violence, but with the shattering weight of recognition. Sometimes the most dangerous place for truth to hide is in the open. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The morning Raymond Halpern was taken into custody, the air carried a sharpness that seemed to mirror the moment. The sky was pale, the kind of muted gray that comes before snow, and the wind pressed steadily against the houses along Alder Street. As the deputies approached his home, Halpern stood beside the front window, his silhouette unmoving. It was unclear whether he had been watching them walk up the path or staring past his own reflection. But when they knocked, he opened the door with a practiced calm, as if greeting parishioners arriving for a church meeting. Sheriff Rowe stood at the front. His face showed none of the triumph that younger officers might have displayed. Instead, he wore the steady, solemn expression of a man who understood the weight of what was happening. He read the charges carefully, each word measured, giving Halpern time to absorb them. For the first time in his life, the man who had blended effortlessly into the fabric of the town looked unsteady, the color draining from his cheeks as officers asked him to place his hands in front of him. Halpern didn't protest. He didn't argue. He only asked one question, barely audible in the cold. "How did you find me?" Rowe held up the evidence bag containing the pale floppy disk. Halpern's eyes lingered on it with an expression that flickered between disbelief and resignation. For decades, he had trusted the anonymity of his tools, never imagining that technology would evolve enough to expose him. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. Some stepped out onto their porches, arms folded across their chests, struggling to reconcile the man being led away with the one who had passed out bulletins on Sunday mornings. A young mother pulled her child close, whispering something that was part caution, part disbelief. A retired couple who had known Halpern since his youth exchanged a look that held years of broken trust. As the convoy pulled away, the silence in the street felt unusually heavy. It wasn't fear. It was the quiet unraveling of an illusion the town had lived with for nearly half a century. At the sheriff's office, Halpern sat across from investigators in a room that smelled faintly of metal and old paper. A tape recorder sat on the table. Rowe joined quietly, his presence less an interrogation tactic and more a witness to the culmination of years spent searching for answers. Halpern avoided his eyes at first, staring instead at the blank wall behind him. When the evidence was laid out, metadata printouts, file reconstructions, timeline alignments, Halpern showed no outward panic. But his hands betrayed him, twitching slightly whenever his name appeared next to the digital traces. Investigators walked him through the drafts of the letters recovered from the disk. They showed him the printer signature, the timestamp matching the night of one of the taunts sent in 1994. The early version of a false confession he had crafted, designed to redirect suspicion. At first, he denied everything, insisting someone had accessed the church computer without permission. But as more evidence surfaced, his building inspection logs matching the dates he had been near several victims, his involvement in church groups tying him close to their routines, his posture sagged. A moment of quiet passed across him, as if the realization had finally settled that the decades-long veil had lifted and there was no way back into the silence that once protected him. When asked why he had done it, he stared at the table. His voice, when it emerged, was steady but hollow. "They trusted me," he said. It was easy. The room felt colder after those words, a chill that seemed to settle in the walls. The trial began 6 months later in a courtroom, brightened by tall windows that let in more light than anyone seemed comfortable with. Rows of wooden benches filled with townspeople who had come to see the quiet man they once greeted in grocery store aisles. The Ellingtons sat near the front, side by side, Eleanor holding a handkerchief she rarely used, but clutched tightly nonetheless. Her husband rested his hand atop hers, the gesture steady and worn. The prosecution began with the digital evidence, the floppy disk, the metadata signatures, the printer code that pointed to the church office. They presented old letters from the early 80s and mid-90s, displaying the matching phrasing and structure alongside the drafts recovered from the disk. Experts explained the forensic tools used to extract the data, walking the jury through the technological evolution that made the breakthrough possible. The defense attempted to cast doubt, raising questions about access to the computer, suggesting that anyone on the church staff might have touched the disk. But the deeper the prosecution went into Halpern's patterns, his work routes, his timing, his proximity to multiple victims, the more the arguments began to crumble. They presented a map that showed his inspection duties aligning with the locations of several attacks. Even the old nylon thread found in Mara's window frame matched a model of cord Halpern once kept in his workshop. Still, the courtroom was silent throughout, as though the community needed the full weight of the truth to settle before they allowed themselves to respond. There was no outburst, no shouted condemnation. Only the steady, quiet listening of people who had spent years carrying unspoken questions. When the Ellingtons took the stand, they didn't speak of anger. Eleanor described the last phone call she had received from her daughter, her voice soft but unwavering. Thomas spoke of the years spent searching for answers, his tone steady but threaded with exhaustion. Both of them described the weight of time, how it had changed them, how it had lingered in their home like an invisible shadow. Their presence didn't accuse Halpern. It illuminated the emptiness he had left behind. During the closing arguments, the prosecutor held the floppy disk up briefly in the light. It looked unremarkable, cheap plastic, yellowed edges, a faint scuff on the corner, but its presence held a gravity that transcended its appearance. "Sometimes truth hides in the smallest places," the prosecutor said. "Sometimes justice waits inside what we overlook." When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom remained still. The Ellingtons held hands. Rowe leaned back on the bench, closing his eyes for a moment, allowing the tension of decades to settle around him. Outside, the breeze rustled the trees along the courthouse lawn. The verdict came faster than anyone expected. Guilty on all counts. The judge read the sentence slowly. Multiple life terms without possibility of parole. Halpern showed no emotion. He simply lowered his gaze, as if acknowledging the finality of the words. Eleanor wept quietly, not from triumph, but from a release that felt almost foreign after so many years of restraint. Thomas bowed his head, letting the weight slip from his shoulders in small increments. As Halpern was escorted out, he paused briefly, turning his head as if searching for someone in the crowd. His eyes passed over familiar faces, people he had once greeted, once deceived, but landed on no one in particular. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a muted thud that sounded like the end of a long, bitter season. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered in small knots. They spoke in hushed tones, their expressions a mix of grief, disbelief, and something gentler, a quiet relief that felt fragile, like new growth pushing through hardened soil. People who had once attended potlucks with Halpern now struggled to reconcile their memories with the truth laid bare before them. Sheriff Rowe stepped out last. He stood on the top step, looking at the families of other victims who had come for support. He approached the Ellingtons, his voice low as he said, "I wish it could have been sooner." Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of weary gratitude. Later that evening, Eleanor placed Mara's favorite hymn book on the dining table. She opened it to a page marked years earlier, an unfinished notation in the margin in her daughter's careful script. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to hum the melody. It drifted through the house, soft and wavering, a quiet reclaiming of something that had been taken. Justice had not erased the years of absence. It had not undone the sorrow. But it had closed a circle that had remained open far too long. And in that small, essential closure, there was room for breath again. In the fading light of that day, one truth settled over Elmsbrook, a truth both heavy and redemptive. Justice had arrived quietly, carried not by vengeance or spectacle, but by persistence, memory, and a relic of forgotten technology that refused to remain silent. In the months after the verdict, Elmsbrook settled into a quieter shape. The shock of learning that the man who once stood in their church aisles had lived a double life slowly loosened its grip, leaving behind a gentler, steadier understanding of what justice could look like after nearly half a century. The town didn't celebrate, it breathed. And in a place that had waited so long for answers, breathing felt like a kind of renewal. For the Ellingtons, mornings changed first. Eleanor no longer paused at the piano with the same heaviness. Some days she dusted it humming softly, letting sound into rooms that had been too silent for too long. Thomas began taking short walks again, each step less burdened by the weight he had carried for decades. Their grief didn't vanish, but it settled into a softer fold inside their lives, no longer cutting quite as sharply when they touched it. Sheriff Rowe, nearing retirement, often found himself standing on the courthouse lawn in the early evening, watching the wind move through the trees. He carried the knowledge that justice had arrived late, but not too late. He kept one printed copy of the metadata report in his desk drawer as a reminder that persistence could outlive doubt, and that even the smallest artifact, a forgotten disk, a misplaced item, could become the key to everything. Sometimes he ran his thumb along the edge of the paper, imagining the years that might have changed had this technology existed earlier. Yet he held no bitterness, only a quiet recognition of the work behind him and the hope that others would continue it. The town itself changed in subtle ways. The school placed a small brass plaque near the music room in honor of Mara, etched with her name, and a single line, "Her voice lives in every note." Students asked about her. Teachers told fragments of her story, and parents explained that justice sometimes takes longer than anyone expects. On warm days when children practiced choir near the open windows, the harmonies carried through the hallways in a way that felt like an unfinished melody finally being completed. What lingered most was not the horror of what happened, but the quiet strength of what remained. People learned to look at each other a little more directly, to ask questions they once avoided, to honor the spaces where trust had been fractured by acknowledging them instead of pretending they never existed. Healing arrived slowly, but it arrived all the same. On the day the case file was formally closed, Grace Mallory visited the evidence room one last time. She paused in front of the shelf where the small white box had once been tucked away. The replacement container, sealed, labeled, cataloged properly, sat neatly beside newer digital media. She held the floppy disk in its final evidence pouch for a moment, studying the scuffed plastic that had carried a truth no one else had seen. It felt light in her hands, fragile even, yet it had outlived secrets, silence, and fear. When she returned it to the shelf, she whispered a soft acknowledgement to the artifact that had changed everything. Outside, the wind stretched across the prairie with a sound almost like breath, sweeping through the fields and over the rooftops. The same wind that had once carried unease now moved with a calmer rhythm, settling into the familiar cadence of life in Elmsbrook. Mara's memory didn't end with the conviction. It settled into the town's fabric in choir songs, in quiet moments at the piano, in the way her parents greeted each new day with a little more steadiness. The case had shaped a generation, but its resolution shaped something larger, a belief that time may bend, but truth remains patient, waiting for the world to catch up. And in that patience, there was hope. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.